Welcome to Empathy Stories, where we explore powerful moments of compassion that can change everything. Today's story will take you on a journey with Ethan Carter, a billionaire who encounters two abandoned children in the streets of New York. What begins as an unexpected act of kindness leads to a life-changing realization. Stick around to see how a single night can transform a person's world. Scott Dawson was a man who seemed to have everything. A luxurious mansion perched atop one of the many hills in Beverly Hills. A powerful position as the CEO of his father's company, and the kind of wealth that few could even imagine. Yet, despite all this, there was something deeply missing in his life. Every evening, after another grueling day at the office, Scott would drive home, his car gliding through the winding streets of the city. But his mind was never at peace. The weight of his success, the loneliness that accompanied it, and the burden of expectations pressed on him with a heaviness that never seemed to lift. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city, Scott approached his mansion. The house stood in stark contrast to the world outside. Its tall, stately walls and marble steps illuminated by the soft glow of the lights around the property. The sound of his car's tires on the gravel driveway was the only noise in the otherwise quiet neighborhood. He parked the car and sat for a moment, his fingers resting on the steering wheel as he stared at the looming house before him. He felt a sense of isolation wash over him. It was as if the mansion itself was mocking him, standing in its grandeur, while he, the man who owned it, felt smaller with each passing day. The door creaked open as he stepped inside, greeted by the cool, polished floors beneath his shoes and the silence that seemed to consume everything. The air felt empty. His mother, Helen Dawson, had been living with him for the past few years, after her diagnosis of Alzheimer's. Yet even her presence, which should have filled the house with warmth, was no longer enough to overcome the profound loneliness he felt. She rarely recognized him now, and when she did, it was only fleeting. Their once close bond had been reduced to moments of confusion and forgetfulness. He often wondered if she still remembered the love they had shared, or if that, too, had slipped away into the haze of her illness. "Scott," came the soft voice of Donna, his longtime housekeeper, as she approached from the hallway. She was standing at the foot of the stairs, her expression one of quiet concern. "Your mother asked for you again today," she said, her voice low, but laced with a hint of urgency. "She seems a little worse than usual." "Scott, it's been a difficult day." Scott's heart twisted at the mention of his mother. It had been a while since he'd truly been able to connect with her, but the guilt of not being there, of getting caught up in his work while she faded away, gnawed at him. He nodded silently, following Donna to his mother's room. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, Helen sat in her armchair by the window, her once vibrant eyes now clouded with confusion. She was looking out at the darkened world beyond the glass, her gaze distant and unfocused. It was a sight that had become all too familiar to Scott. He sat beside her, reaching out to gently touch her hand. For a moment, her face softened, as if she might remember him, but then the look faded, and she pulled her hand away. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice faint. "It's me, Mom," Scott said, his voice breaking slightly despite his best efforts to keep it steady. "It's Scott." She blinked at him, as though trying to make sense of the name, but then her gaze shifted once more to the window. Scott stayed there for a while, just sitting in the quiet, waiting for some sign of recognition. He wanted to tell her about his day, to share his life with her, as they had done so many times before. But he knew that the words would be lost. Instead, he simply watched her, wishing for the person she had once been to come back, even for just a moment. Eventually, Donna returned to check on him, gently reminding him that it was late, and he needed to rest. But Scott couldn't bring himself to leave. The silence of the house pressed in on him again. It was too much, too empty. He stood up, giving his mother one last glance before heading out of her room. The house felt like a tomb as he made his way down the grand hallway, the gleaming marble floors echoing his footsteps. He wasn't ready to go to bed. Not yet. He needed to clear his mind. It had been one of those days, full of the usual meetings and decisions. but also filled with an aching void that he couldn't seem to fill. So, he made his way to the door and stepped outside into the cool night air. The estate was surrounded by dense woods, a remnant of his father's love for nature. It had been his father's idea to build the mansion here, away from the noise of the city, where he could escape to the solitude of nature. Tonight, Scott sought the same solace as he walked down the winding path that led into the trees. The world around him seemed to fade away. The chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the wind were the only sounds that filled the air. The further he walked, the more his thoughts seemed to quiet. It wasn't long before he heard something that stopped him in his tracks, a faint sound, barely audible over the night silence. At first, he thought it might be the wind, but then it came again, soft, broken sobs. Scott's heart skipped a beat. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, a cry for help. He followed the noise through the trees, his footsteps quickening, until he came upon a small clearing. There, beneath a large oak tree, sat a small figure, a little girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old, huddled in the dirt, her knees drawn to her chest as she sobbed quietly. Scott's heart ached at the sight of her. He approached carefully, not wanting to startle her. "Hey," he said softly, his voice gentle. "Are you okay? What are you doing out here all alone?" The girl looked up, her face streaked with tears. She was frightened, but there was something about her, something that made Scott feel an urgent need to help her. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her voice trembling. I don't have anywhere to go," she whispered. "I got lost." Scott's brow furrowed in concern. She was young, too young to be out here alone in the woods at this hour. He stepped closer, crouching down to her level. "Where's your family?" he asked gently. She shook her head, her lips trembling as she tried to keep her composure. They're gone," she said quietly. The words hung in the air, a heavy silence following. Scott's mind raced. She was homeless, alone in the woods, in the dead of night. His heart tightened as he tried to process what to do. "How about we get you somewhere safe?" Scott asked, his voice steady. "It's too cold to be out here." The girl hesitated but then nodded, her small hand reaching out for his. "Okay," she whispered. And so, with one decision, Scott's life took a turn he hadn't expected. The quiet, empty mansion would no longer be his alone. He would bring this little girl into his life, and it would change everything, but he didn't know just how much yet. Scott's mind raced as he guided Emily through the darkened streets toward his mansion. The evening had taken an unexpected turn, and he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this night would change his life in ways he hadn't imagined. The small girl, frightened and lost in the woods, had found a place in his heart in just a few short minutes. Her innocent trust and vulnerability stirred something in him, something long buried beneath the layers of responsibility and guilt he carried every day. The mansion loomed ahead, its grandiose architecture bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. It was a far cry from the small, makeshift shelter Emily had described, and the stark contrast between their worlds was not lost on Scott. He'd spent years building this empire, accumulating wealth and prestige, but it had come at the cost of the simple joys of life, the kind of joy that a child like Emily seemed to exude without even trying. When they reached the front door, Scott hesitated before opening it. He knew Donna would be waiting inside, and though she was a loyal housekeeper and someone he trusted, Scott could already hear her concerns brewing. He wasn't sure how she would react to a young girl suddenly appearing in their home. Donna had always been pragmatic, and she rarely deviated from her routines. The thought of bringing a stranger into the house, especially one so young, was likely unsettling for her. "Who is this?" Donna asked, stepping into the hallway as the door swung open. Her gaze immediately landed on Emily, and Scott could see the skepticism in her eyes. "This is Emily," Scott replied, his voice firm but gentle. "I found her in the woods. She was lost and alone. I couldn't just leave her there." Donna's expression softened for a moment, but the concern never left her eyes. "Scott, you can't just bring strangers into this house. What if she's just a kid?" "Donna," Scott interrupted. "She doesn't have anywhere to go. We can help her tonight." and we'll figure out what to do in the morning. Donna's lips tightened into a thin line. But after a moment of silent contemplation, she sighed. All right, but I'll make sure she stays in the guest room. We can't risk anyone being near your mother without knowing more about her. Scott nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. His mother's health was deteriorating rapidly due to Alzheimer's, and he couldn't afford to take any risks. But tonight, he couldn't bear the thought of turning Emily away. She was alone, frightened, and in need of care, something Scott himself had felt for years but had buried beneath the weight of his responsibilities. He felt a stirring deep within him, something that had been dormant for far too long, a sense of compassion, of human connection. Thank you, Donna, Scott said quietly. I'll make sure everything is taken care of. Donna turned to prepare something warm for Emily, and Scott knelt down to the girl's level. Hey, are you hungry? He asked gently. His voice was softer than he had intended, and he realized it was because he wasn't just talking to a lost child. He was talking to someone who reminded him of the innocence and vulnerability he had forgotten. Emily nodded shyly, her large brown eyes never leaving him. I don't want to be a bother, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You're not a bother, Emily, Scott reassured her, reaching out to touch her shoulder. I'm just glad you're safe. You've been through a lot, haven't you? She nodded again, her eyes welling with unshed tears. I don't have anywhere to go, she admitted, her voice breaking. I built a house out of cardboard in the woods. It's the only place I can stay. Scott's heart clenched at her words. He had heard stories of children in need, but hearing it from Emily, seeing her so small and fragile, hit him harder than he expected. Well, tonight, you're going to stay here, he said softly, and we'll figure everything out tomorrow. As Donna returned with a steaming bowl of soup, Emily's eyes widened at the sight of it. The warm meal, something so simple yet so foreign to her, seemed to bring a sense of comfort to the girl. She hesitated for a moment before taking the spoon, her hands trembling slightly. Go ahead, Scott urged, smiling at her. It's for you. Emily smiled back, but it was a sad smile, one that carried a weight far beyond her years. She ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a rare treat. For Scott, it was a humbling reminder of how much he had taken for granted in his own life. His mansion, his wealth, the luxuries he had come to expect. It all seemed so meaningless in comparison to the simple joy of feeding a hungry child. When she finished, Scott led Emily upstairs to the guest room. It was modest but cozy, with soft linens and a warm blanket. The room was a stark contrast to the cold, impersonal nature of the rest of the house. Scott could see that Emily was exhausted, her eyes drooping with fatigue. Get some rest, Scott said gently, tucking her into the bed. You're safe here. We'll talk more in the morning. As he closed the door behind him, Scott stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the house. His thoughts were a jumble, concerns about Emily's future, about his mother's health, about the life he had built that still felt so empty. He had come to a place where success was measured in bank accounts and business deals. But as he stood there in the quiet of his mansion, he realized that it was moments like this, moments of human connection, that made life worth living. For the first time in years, the silence of the house didn't feel so heavy. It felt alive, filled with the promise of something new, something that had been missing for far too long. As he made his way to his office, he couldn't help but think of Emily's face, her wide eyes, her quiet smile. She was just a child, but in that moment, she had reminded him of the things he had lost. He wasn't sure what the future held for her, or for him. But one thing was clear, tonight, everything had changed. The next morning, Scott awoke with a sense of quiet anticipation. The house was still and calm, sunlight spilling softly across the floors. He had spent the night thinking about Emily and the life she had left behind. What could he do for her? What would happen next? Despite the uncertainty, he felt a glimmer of purpose for the first time in a long while. Downstairs, Donna was already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. Her movements were slower today, and Scott could sense that the presence of Emily had affected her. Too, Donna had a soft spot for people in need, even if she didn't always show it. How's Emily this morning? Scott asked as he entered the kitchen. "She's fine," Donna replied, turning toward him with a small, reluctant smile. "She woke up early and started exploring the house. I told her to stay put, but she couldn't help herself." Scott nodded, picturing Emily's wide eyes as she wandered through the mansion, taking in the opulence she'd never seen before. He couldn't imagine how overwhelming it must have been for her. Suddenly, he heard the faint sound of music, soft strumming from the hallway. Scott froze. The melody was unfamiliar, but somehow soothing. He followed the sound to find Emily sitting on the floor outside Helena's room, cradling a guitar. She was playing with surprising skill, her fingers moving confidently over the strings as she hummed. Scott lingered in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. Helena sat in her chair, her frail form wrapped in a shawl. Her eyes were closed, but she looked peaceful. Emily was playing a song, a melody Scott hadn't heard in years. It was one of his mother's compositions, a song Helena had written when Scott was young. Her music had been beautiful once, but the disease had stolen her ability to play. Now, through Emily, it was being brought back to life. Scott's heart swelled with emotion. For a moment, it felt like the fog surrounding his mother had lifted just slightly. He stepped into the room, his voice barely a whisper. "Mom," he asked, unsure if she could hear him. Helena didn't respond at first, but then something remarkable happened. Her fingers twitched, her expression softened, and she opened her eyes, focusing on Emily. The young girl's voice filled the air as she softly sang the lyrics to the song. Helena's face brightened, her eyes locking with Emily's. Scott couldn't believe it. "Mom," he repeated, his voice breaking. "Can you hear her? She's playing your song." Helena looked at him with clarity in her eyes. "Scott, my son," she whispered. The words were fragile, but real. Tears welled up in Scott's eyes. His mother hadn't spoken like this in months. He knelt beside her, squeezing her hand. "I'm here, Mom. I'm right here." Emily stopped playing and watched the exchange in silence. She had done it. She had reached Scott's mother in a way that no one else had been able to. "Thank you," Scott whispered to Emily, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for this." Days passed, and with each one, Emily became more of a fixture in Scott's life. She was no longer just a lost child he had found in the woods. She was family. Her laughter echoed through the mansion, filling the empty spaces, and her presence brought warmth where there had been only silence. One afternoon, as Scott sat in his office going over some paperwork, Emily burst into the room with a stack of papers in her hands, her face radiant with excitement. "Dad," she exclaimed, "is this real? Are we really a family now?" Scott smiled, his heart swelling. He had been waiting for this moment. "Yes, Emily," he said softly. "It's real. You're my daughter now. Officially." Emily's eyes widened with joy as she handed him the adoption papers. She threw her arms around him, her small frame enveloped in a tight hug. "Thank you, Dad. Thank you for everything." Scott held her close, his heart full of love. "No, thank you," he said quietly. "You've changed my life." Later that evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Scott and Emily sat together on the porch, watching the sky turn from golden to pink. The mansion, once a place of loneliness, had become a home, and in that moment, Scott realized that it wasn't the house or the wealth that mattered. It was the love they shared, the family they had become. Helena, too, had found new moments of clarity. Thanks to Emily, her laughter had returned, and even in her fleeting moments of awareness, she had embraced Emily as part of the family. The mansion was no longer a place of emptiness. It was a place of love, laughter, and music. Scott looked over at Emily, her eyes filled with excitement for the future. He smiled, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. Thank you for watching this touching story on Empathy Stories. Sometimes, it's the unexpected moments that bring the greatest changes in our lives. We hope this story inspired you to reflect on kindness and the power of compassion. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories that move the heart. See you in the next video.